300-pound Paul Le Roux lay flat on the ground as DEA agents tried to arrest him. "I'm not moving," he said. It took more than 10 men to carry him out of the building. See, Paul had spent the last decade building one of the most sophisticated criminal empires from his laptop. As a self-taught programmer from Zimbabwe, he once built encryption software used by the NSA. Now, he was laundering hundreds of millions through fake pharmacies, weapons deals, and shell companies spanning 6 continents. But in this moment, it had finally caught up to him. One of his former mercenaries, a guy Paul had once tried to kill, had lured him to Liberia with a deal too good to pass up, a meth distribution pipeline for the Colombian cartels. Paul realized too late it was a setup. Just before boarding the extradition flight back to the US, he pulled the same move again. "I apologize in advance, but I do not want to get on your plane," he said. Then he went limp. Dead weight, they had to drag him on board. But once airborne, he changed his tune. "Well played, gentlemen, well played." Then quieter. "Just promise me I won't die in jail. That's all I want." Little did he know the DEA didn't want him in a cell. They had bigger plans. He wasn't just some hacker gone rogue. He had sold weapons to Iran, built a private army in Somalia, ordered hits over email. When they landed, they kept his arrest quiet, then handed him a laptop and put him back in business. This is the story of Paul Le Roux.
His story parallels Elon Musk's story quite closely. He's South African and was a kid who got really into programming, and that was his way in the world. And he's really kind of doing the same stuff on the other side of the law. Paul Le Roux wanted to be the biggest criminal on the planet. That's what he wanted. And he set about trying to achieve that, and I would argue he possibly did.
Paul was born to disappear. Christmas Eve 1972 in Rhodesia, the old colonial name for Zimbabwe. There's no father listed on his birth certificate, and to this day, nobody's really sure who his mother was. See, shortly after he was born, she vanished, and Paul was handed off for adoption. At just 2 months old, he was taken in by a white couple living across the country in a remote mining town called Mashava. They gave him the name Paul Le Roux and never told him he was adopted. And for a while, that was the end of the story, until they had to pack up and leave Zimbabwe behind. The colonial era was collapsing. White minority rule was on its way out, and the Le Roux family decided to move south to start a new life in South Africa. Paul had just turned 12 when they settled in another dusty mining town. It's around this time that Paul got his hands on a computer, a reward for doing chores. But from the moment that CRT monitor flickered on, the rest of the world faded out. He was hooked. As a teenager, Paul drifted from the people around him, drawn deeper into the world of code. But that isolation didn't keep him out of trouble. When he was 15 in the late 80s, local police raided his house. Paul had been busted for selling pornography. His family was stunned, did everything they could to keep this quiet. This was a big deal back then, especially where he was living. This knack for entrepreneurship would carry through the rest of his life, but for now, he was young, still in school, excelled in almost all subjects, was getting straight A's with the exception of Afrikaans. Paul called it a dead language, refused to even open the textbook. By 16, he had dropped out entirely. Paul wasn't going to do something that he didn't want to do just because someone was telling him to do it. But he wasn't done learning. He enrolled in a local programming course. As legend has it, in one of the very first classes, Paul explained the material back to the instructor in such precise technical detail that the professor emailed him saying he didn't need to come back to class. Paul apparently finished all the material for the one-year course in just 2 months and graduated top of the class. By 18, Paul left South Africa for London. As a young prodigy, he landed a job as a software developer and met his first love, an Australian girl named Michelle. After a few months in the UK, they bounced to Seattle, then Australia. And with a wedding ring on his finger, Paul secured Australian citizenship. But it didn't take long for the resentment to kick in. He hated the heat, hated the people, hated the rules. And he took all of that out online on something called the Usenet, basically the 90s version of Reddit. In this post, he writes, "My girlfriend's Australian. She wanted to show me her country and I've regretted it ever since." Here he's responding to someone. He's saying, "I would agree, Australia is one of the most livable countries." Then the top 156, only just tipped out of position 155 by Iraq. Goes on to get a lot worse than this. Classic rage bait at this point, maybe. I dug through all his old messages and he got into fights with everyone. This guy who he's responding to literally changed his email to "F you, Paul." Even by early internet standards, a lot of these messages are ugly, perhaps too ugly for YouTube's terms of service, but the important thing here is that underneath the trolling and the bigotry, Paul was angry, perhaps a little directionless. He couldn't control the world around him, and so he turned to control the one thing that he could, his computer, because this whole time, Paul was working on a massive project. See, before Paul built a criminal empire, he built encryption software so strong that even the NSA couldn't crack it. Paul wasn't just trolling on Usenet. He was also deeply embedded in encryption boards, civilized nerdy forums where he actually held thoughtful conversations with other programmers. Because behind the scenes, for 2 years, Paul had been hammering away at code. No job, no income, still stuck in a country he hated. Just a keyboard, a monitor, and an obsession. And in 1999, out of nowhere, he dropped it on this post. Encryption for the masses, or E4M. Anyone could download it on e4m.net. It encrypted your entire hard drive. It meant if someone came, took your computer like law enforcement, they wouldn't be able to understand what anything on it was without a special password. And it worked so well, to this day, the NSA can't crack it. Online, people started calling him the Encryption Einstein. The website carried a manifesto. Quote, "The battle for privacy has long since been lost in the real world." The rest of this goes on to rail against mass surveillance. Paul had strong opinions about privacy, and clearly he valued his own. Now, there are legitimate reasons to want that level of protection. I'm a big proponent of encryption, but I will be honest. Tools this powerful, they don't just protect the innocent, they also empower the guilty, as we've seen in many of my videos. That's a good time to hit that subscribe button, by the way, if you're enjoying. For Paul, well, I don't think it was exactly in his nature to be on the right side of that line. Still, he gave this power to everyone. He made E4M free and open source so anyone could tweak it, lock down their data, and have that privacy. A true gentleman. This was also a big stepping stone in his life. E4M changed everything. Not long after its release, he divorced Michelle and moved to Hong Kong, then to Rotterdam, where he met his second wife, Lillian. But now, Paul had a new problem. He was broke. This is when he caught the attention of Wilfried Hafner, an Italian businessman developing a commercial encryption tool called DriveCrypt at his company, SecureStar. Hafner was impressed by E4M, and Paul needed the cash. So when Hafner offered him a job, he took it, but it didn't last long. While working at SecureStar, Paul secretly used the company's time and their proprietary code to update E4M. Hafner had been paying Paul to build and steal code that the public could now use for free. Hafner was furious, Paul was fired, but more importantly, this ended up being a messy controversy all over the Usenet. And encryption, being such a small niche, well, this reputation will become inescapable. Paul still needed money though, and so for a short while after being kicked out, he started making programs for Canadian and Romanian-based casinos. But as talented as he was as a programmer, he was a terrible marketer. Fell flat on his face again. In the meantime, he was also on a job hunt on Usenet, but again, that reputation. He couldn't land anything, and the situation continued to escalate. He returned to Zimbabwe in search of his birth certificate, only to be abruptly pulled away by his aunt and uncle who revealed to him that, hey, you were adopted. Now 30 years old, he was left reeling. This discovery left a scar on him. He was officially on track to waste his life. Paul needed a big idea, and fast. And so it's around this time in 2003 that he came up with a brilliant plan: online prescription pharmacies in the United States. And this marks the start of his actual career, a career that was about to lead him down a very dark path.
He created E4M, and then there was a company that wanted to commercialize it, and he basically signed on with this company to try to commercialize it. They got into a dispute. He believed, I think, that he got screwed. He kind of soured on open source software in some of the forums and said, like, look, I thought this was supposed to like somehow benefit me and it never did, and I've spent all these hours on it. And then TrueCrypt emerged. And so that was not clear if that was a challenger to what they were doing. Maybe he was behind it. It's sort of a big mess. But then the thing that was clear was he wanted to make a lot of money, and he had not done so. And he felt like, I think at that time, programmers were starting to make a lot of money in the tech industry. He was not making a lot of money, and he got into online pills. There's a couple different theories about how he did. And he sort of came up with this system that was perfect for mass distribution of painkillers. This was going to be the way he was going to like make his fortune. And I think he knew pretty quickly that he was going to succeed at that. Like the signs were there from the very beginning that this was like an extremely lucrative thing to be doing.
That's Evan Ratcliffe. He wrote the book on Paul Le Roux, which was a huge inspiration for this video. I don't want to breeze over his point about TrueCrypt. TrueCrypt was based on E4M's codebase, but became wildly popular. Eventually, Edward Snowden was recommending it. The one thing that's certain about Paul is that he was a visionary. He had this idea to create what was a telemedicine platform before telemedicine platforms existed. Immediately, he starts looking for US citizens to help him open bank accounts on the Usenet, because from the outside, Paul understood that this had to look legit. Real US accounts, real US corporate registrations, if he was going to be able to attract real US doctors to write prescriptions and the pharmacies to fill them. He could write all of the code himself, but the next piece of the puzzle was going to be a call center. This was the early 2000s, after all. People expected to be able to talk with someone to check orders, ask questions, file complaints. Paul knew these two Israeli brothers, Boaz and Tomer Tiger, who were already operating call centers in Israel, so he partnered up with them. Employees in these call centers were told to adopt American-sounding names and tell customers that they were located in Utah. And with that, he spun up the website. Actually, eventually, hundreds of them, with names like buycheapmeds.com, All the Best RX, My Online Drugstore, 123 Online Pharmacy. The list goes on and on. In fact, many of these were not directly run by Paul. He had created an affiliate program where anyone could spin up a website using his code base to earn 60% of each sale. This was advertised through spam campaigns and websites he set up called netbizbucks.com, pillengine.com, rxpayouts.com. Like, the list goes on and on, but all of these had this big banner advertising, quote, open your own online pharmacy. Paul's idea was to dominate the search results for anyone looking to get drugs online. When you go to one of these websites, you'd just fill out a brief medical questionnaire, a few clicks claiming back pain, insomnia, anxiety, that sort of thing. No in-person visit, no phone call. Through the RX Limited backend, these forms were routed to real American doctors for review who were paid per consultation, I use that term lightly, for issuing the actual prescription. Some doctors were actually diligently looking through each request, approving some, denying others, but some were just clicking the big accept all button, approving thousands of these without any real consideration in a second. At its peak, one of these doctors was making over $100,000 a month. From there, the orders with their legitimate prescriptions were sent to small US pharmacies. We're talking mom and pop shops, not the big chains who shipped the meds out via FedEx. In exchange, they got bulk business, that was the biggest part of this, a free computer, a free printer, preloaded with a custom software suite that Paul had wrote himself called PCMS to manage this entire process. They used that to track the orders, they used it to get the prepaid shipping labels, and review the actual doctor sign-offs. Like, to the pharmacies, this looked totally legit. And the drugs? Well, the websites offered everything from anti-hair loss medications to generic forms of Viagra. But the real money came from three specific medications. Tramadol, a synthetic opioid, weaker than Oxycontin but still addictive, Carisoprodol, a muscle relaxant often prescribed for back pain, and Furosec, a headache medication that contains a sedative. These are all painkillers that people abuse, and they sold a lot. At its peak, RX Limited processed over 10,000 orders a day. In one 3-week window in 2007, they shipped 57,000 orders. Across 16 months, an estimated 72 million pills were sent out through RX Limited systems. The key was, these weren't Schedule II narcotics. In fact, at the time, none of them were federally classified as controlled substances. And that was the loophole. Paul was smart. His websites were careful to have prominent disclaimers stating that, quote, we do not offer controlled substances. Our company is committed to meeting and exceeding all government regulations. Technically, he wasn't lying, because under the law at the time, if a licensed doctor issued a prescription and a licensed pharmacy filled it, even for an addictive drug, it was legal. Even though Paul's website was clearly designed for mass distribution. Remember, telemedicine hadn't really been done before, and so regulation had yet to catch up to it. Crap, he ran into more trouble just hosting these websites because of his spam campaigns. At one point, half of all spam emails on the internet were related to RX Limited, some from him, some from his huge affiliate network. Because of this, web hosts started shutting down websites and domains, but Paul is a tech genius after all, so he just developed his own host, called it AB Systems. He was untouchable, opened more call call centers in Israel, then some in the Philippines. By 2008, he had over 200 employees in Manila. All of them thought it was a totally legit company. Even more crazy, none of them knew that Paul was behind it because he was so careful to stay anonymous. He was running all of this from behind his computer. Every payment routed through shell companies, register under a slew of fake passports and IDs. This is a list of those names, but one sticks out in particular: Salachi Le Roux. He was using this name years before the release of Bitcoin. Bitcoin was made by an anonymous creator under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. To this day, the true identity of its creator has never been uncovered. But the speculation for Paul is not crazy. The similarity of these names, his background in encryption, is very similar to what was used to create Bitcoin, and he certainly had a need for a decentralized online money out of government control. And like E4M, Bitcoin's initial codebase was developed in private before being released to the public. Either way, Paul was right to be privacy obsessed because 2 DEA agents were hot on his tail. And perhaps, like the DEA agents, researching criminals all the time takes a weird toll on me. Life, work, relationships can take a toll on all of us. Throughout the year, I'll often hit a wall, feel burnt out, irritable, not sleeping properly, developing all sorts of bad habits like entire bags of those delicious sour keys that I know aren't really that good for me to cope. I realize sometimes you just need someone outside your circle to help you untangle what's going on. I know therapists will listen, ask questions, and help you see things from new perspectives, give you advice and techniques to make positive changes in your life. But to me, therapy always felt like this massive thing to start. Google searches, appointments, research, long drives. It's always been easier to do nothing. That's where BetterHelp comes in, the paid partner of this video. They're on a mission to make starting therapy easier. All you gotta do is fill out a questionnaire and you'll match with a therapist as soon as possible. And you can easily switch therapists anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. With over 7,000 reviews and a 4.3 rating on Trustpilot, BetterHelp is a platform you can trust. So give them a try now. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/crumb and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Again, that's betterhelp.com/crumb, 10% off your first month. In 2007, 2 rookie DEA agents, Kimberly Brill and Stephen Holdren, accidentally stumbled onto Paul's empire. They were part of the DEA's Diversion Control Division, a task force focused on ways prescription drugs make it into black markets. Usually they busted shady doctors and pharmacies, but as of late, their focus was shifting more and more to a rise in websites offering prescription drugs. Except they felt like they were making no progress. When one was shut down, another would pop up. Stephen thought of this like busting street-level dealers. Didn't make any real difference to the big bosses running the show. They would just get another person on that corner. But then they had a breakthrough. After another routine controlled buy from a website with the intent of busting pharmacists and doctors writing bogus prescriptions, they decided, more or less on a whim, to subpoena FedEx for the shipping records attached to the account responsible for buying the label. They couldn't believe what came back. One FedEx account being used by over 40 pharmacies nationwide, shipping thousands of orders a week. The account holder traced back to a shell company registered in Delaware named RX Limited. They realized this wasn't just another one-off pharmacy gone rogue. This was a nation-scale drug ring, the type they had always hoped to uncover, a potentially career-making case. From there, they immediately followed the records. Company addresses traced to mail drops in Texas and Florida, essentially dead ends. Then they found the hundreds of websites and the robust affiliate program. But more critically, using their tech skills, they discovered a shared backend system that redirected every order to a domain called cartadmin.com. They knew whoever controlled this was behind the entire operation. But whoever it was didn't seem to really have any true American presence, and they didn't even know his name. As they dug farther into the slew of websites, they discovered another problem. RX Limited's focus on those 3 painkillers in specific was a clear way to operate outside the reach of substance control law, but they suspected, just by the sheer volume of orders, RX Limited may be breaking the law in other ways. Over the coming months, they tried to explore this theory, placed a series of controlled buys using increasingly fake and bogus information, going as far as to make up unreal medical conditions when listing the reasons on the medical questionnaire for purchasing drugs, and each time the prescription was approved and the drugs delivered. Unfortunately though, going after the doctors and the pharmacies would make little difference. They were completely replaceable to the machine that was RX Limited. Bust one and another one could easily take their place. They needed the head of the operation, but still, they couldn't find it. Except for one very small clue, very early in the shipments list from FedEx. Amongst all these American orders was an international one, stuck out to them. One time, to a hotel in Manila, a man named Paul Le Roux had been sent some drugs. By the time they took the case to Kent Bailey, a veteran special agent at the DEA, they had found a little more evidence pointing to Le Roux. First, they found that RX Limited was renting server space at a company called Q9, based out of Canada, with the account tied to the email address pleroux@swprofessionals.com. That email led them to this defunct website, a programming service that Paul had tried running in the early 2000s but had since closed down. On the About Us, they found that Paul was listed as the director. It was easy to think that, hey, maybe he was just contracted to help set up this RX Limited empire and that he has nothing to do with actually running it, but the agents knew deep down if he was the one paying for the servers that these were being hosted on, probably had a little more involvement than a third-party contractor. Then they noticed several of the servers at Q9 were named after chess pieces. To the agents, it almost felt like an invitation to join the game, and so they did, and the case was officially named Operation Checkmate. The rookie agents had one more piece of information. A Philippine phone number that they had found was registered to Paul Le Roux. Kent Bailey ordered a trace report on it. What they got back was a 30-day call history. They saw outgoing and incoming calls to Ghana, the Congo, Brazil. But most of all, it was the calls made to Somalia that bothered Kent the most. He was ex-military, had served in the region, and he knew one thing for sure. Quote, people go to those places because they are lawless. This guy is not setting up an effing pharmacy in Somalia.
Why did he keep going? He made hundreds of millions of dollars. Why is he getting into meth trafficking from North Korea? Why is he setting up a compound in Somalia? And the question is why is Mark Zuckerberg still going into Facebook every day? What does he want? He has more money than he could ever spend. He's built a thing. Why is he still doing it? And the answer is kind of the same. Paul Le Roux wanted to be the biggest criminal on the planet. That's what he wanted.
For the investigators, by mid-2008, this case had become their full-time jobs. And the deeper they dug, the more intricate it all became. Remember the cart admin domain that appeared early in their investigation was responsible for routing every RX Limited order? Well, the investigators weren't technical, so it took them a little while to catch up to it, but they eventually figured out how to trace that domain. They found it was registered by a company called AB Systems. And this part blew their mind. AB Systems wasn't some sketchy web host, it was officially accredited by ICANN, like GoDaddy or Namecheap. It could create and sell domains. But when they pulled the full list of domains it handled, what came back was entirely online pharmacies. And the AB Systems website, just a blank login page, no sign up, no contact information. This wasn't a normal business. It was a closed system. At first, they thought AB Systems must be working with RX Limited, so they issued a subpoena to ICANN. The documents that they got back blew that theory out of the water. AB Systems was based at an address in Manila, on the 14th floor of the BDO building, the same address as RX Limited's main call center. And the name on the account was Paul Le Roux. It finally clicked. Le Roux wasn't using this system, he built it. Cart Admin, RX Limited, AB Systems, they weren't partners, they were all him. A fully integrated business. To the investigators, this meant that there was no partners they could work with to help take him down. Everything was being run by him. They did notice, however, amongst the thousands of online pharmacies registered under AB Systems, one domain, unlike all the others, e4m.net, an encryption software published by Paul before RX Limited ever existed. A search on the website's history turned up an old email address, paulca@rocketmail.com. They wondered, did he use this email in the early days to help orchestrate the building of RX Limited? Could they use it to prove that he was the mastermind? With the help of a federal prosecutor, they convinced a judge to sign off on a warrant for Rocketmail. Rocketmail is owned by Yahoo. And the records that came back confirmed everything. Emails from Paul of him negotiating with credit card processors, routing payments through offshore shell companies, creating fake identities, and setting up the call centers. But most of these threads would go dead, kept pointing to a different email, pleroux@server73.net. Server73 isn't Gmail or Yahoo, it's a private mail server, encrypted, secured, no corporate HQ to send a subpoena to. Just like he built everything else, Paul had made his own secure email infrastructure and long ago ditched that rocket mail address. This was really disappointing for the investigators. If that rocket mail address was the one that he was currently using for daily operations, it would have made things a lot easier, but instead they only had these old historical emails. They had no real idea of what he was up to now that the business was much more mature. Meanwhile, Kent Bailey was trying to build a real-world profile on this guy. But for someone terminally online, there was almost nothing. No photos, no social media. Until one of Bailey's analysts stumbled upon a strange lead. An old article from The Hill dated July 2007. It mentioned a man named Paul Le Roux lobbying to buy land in Zimbabwe. He was advocating for the return of white farmers displaced by Robert Mugabe's presidency. It even claimed that he planned to lobby Congress and possibly the White House to achieve this. More importantly to the investigators, the article noted that he had both Australian and South African citizenship. It was the first time that they even had a hint at his background. Then came a breakthrough. A grainy customs photo taken in Guam as Paul passed through US customs on a connection flight. It wasn't what they expected. Heavyset, dyed blonde hair, he wore flip-flops, a t-shirt, and shorts. You wouldn't expect this guy to be running what he was running. But beyond that, they had little more on Paul. Until a tip came in from Hong Kong. A compliance officer at a major bank flagged a string of suspicious wire transfers made between a string of sketchy-sounding shell companies with generic names and a cluster of small US pharmacies. The investigators immediately knew they were looking at the financial skeleton of RX Limited. They moved fast, secured a federal prosecutor, sent international record requests to Hong Kong's financial regulators, subpoenaed the US Treasury's FinCEN office, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, who handle Fed wire transfers for most American banks. And when the data came back, it was staggering. Conservatively, RX Limited was pulling in $250 million a year, about the same revenue Facebook had in its early years. In just a few Hong Kong accounts, they found that Paul Le Roux was sitting on over $50 million in cash. But they realized that was a massive gap between what he was earning and how little was still in those accounts. It meant one thing: there was a river of money flowing somewhere else, but where, that part they still didn't know. Paul didn't trust banks. One of his Hong Kong accounts had already been frozen with tens of millions inside. So he did what every kingpin does. He made the money disappear. Not in offshore accounts, but in gold. Over 2 years, he funneled more than $200 million through shell companies, buying hundreds of gold bars from Swiss dealers, moving them by planes, yachts, and cars to stash houses he set up in Hong Kong. He even started sourcing raw gold from mines in Africa so it would be untraceable. Heck, he eventually set up his own mine. This was a serious operation. And at the helm of all this was perhaps the second most important man in Paul's life, an ex-military Israeli expat living in Hong Kong named Doron Shulman. Paul had met Doron through his growing network of military contractors. See, by 2007, Paul had moved to the capital of the Philippines, Manila, had set up call centers for RX Limited there, employing hundreds of people. More importantly, Manila was a place where he could buy off anyone: police, coast guards, foreign affairs officers, the government. He felt insulated in the Philippines, and if he ever really needed to, he could even pay for murder for hire, have someone killed for around $100 US. Paul bought himself a nice penthouse. Actually, he bought a few of them. But besides a desk and a bed, kept these places unfurnished. To the few higher-ups that worked for RX Limited that actually got to meet Paul in person, they got the impression that he lived in a way that he would be able to pick up and move at a moment's notice. Manila had another cute ancillary benefit for Paul. It was flooded with military contractors from the Iraq War. This is how Paul had met perhaps the most important man to his operations, Dave Smith, a scarred-up Irishman who claimed to have trained militias in Liberia and done security work in Iraq. He became Paul's head of security, tasked with recruiting other contractors, handling all this sensitive logistics, aka the moving and buying and protecting of gold. It's through this circle that Paul more or less ended up hiring a small private army.
And it was a better lifestyle for them to work for Le Roux than it was to go to, say, Afghanistan and work in a more dangerous environment. For them, it was fun, it was exciting. He sent them all over the world to go buy gold or move gold or buy houses. And so that lifestyle was very appealing to them. He paid pretty well, enough that they could live very well in the Philippines. And the alternative lifestyle for them was often security contracting in dangerous war zones. So there were a lot of people available, and I talked to many of them who just thought, okay, well, maybe this is a little illegal, but it's better than my alternatives.
By 2009, Paul had grown bored of the 10% annual growth from his legal-ish pharmacies and wanted, quote, something that made a 500% return. Using this team, Paul tried to launch a logging hustle in the Congo, planned to do the same in Vanuatu, but this stuff was all a bust. But then Dave Smith came to him with an idea, told Paul he could source 10,000 AK-47s. Bulk weapons could be insanely lucrative. He had already been toying with them. One of Dave Smith's first tasks was to organize the construction of a private firing range. This was a place for his growing army to train, zero in weapons, try out new recruits without unwanted onlookers. But now it was going to be used as a cover for buying and stockpiling weapons inside the Philippines because under Philippine rule, a licensed gun club could legally import and hold large quantities of firearms and ammunition. It helped that Paul had also acquired a gun shop called Red, White, and Blue Arms. See, guns might have been one of Paul's only genuine hobbies. Apparently they brought him great joy. He was often at the range shooting off exotic weapons. And so it was the perfect combination. He was going to leverage this to bring in whole shipping containers of weapons and then resell them using the network he had already developed to move gold. But instead of going to safe houses, they would be going to warlords in Africa, Colombian cartels, and militias in unstable regions. The other thing here is that Paul was fantasizing about carving out his own mini-state, taking it by force with a private army, likely somewheres in Africa. And to do that, he was going to need weapons. Gun trafficking on a big scale required some additions to Paul's logistic network, the biggest of which was the ship MV Captain Ufuk. I mean, just look at the size of this thing. For its proof of concept run, Bruce Jones, a British mariner on Paul's payroll, bought the ship in Turkey, sailed it around the Cape, then tied up in Indonesia's state arms manufacturing plant, PT Pindad. See, it had been arranged for soldiers there to load up 20 plain pine crates stamped with an end-user certificate from Mali's Ministry of Defense. This was all fake. Mali's Ministry of Defense wasn't buying any guns. Paul had his lawyers doctor a document. Once loaded, Bruce handed the boat off to a South African skipper, Lawrence Byrne, along with 13 Georgian sailors to finish the trip. By mid-August 2009, they sailed it to a spot just 3 hours west of Manila, where they idled offshore, waiting for a launch boat to shuttle the cargo ashore into one of Paul's warehouses. This was really Paul's second phase of gun trafficking. He was doing some stuff with shotguns before this, but now he was entering into bulky military rifles. Read it through these fake shadow certificates, offload it at night off a big cargo ship, and remanifest it as sports firearms. From there, he was sending them onwards to, number one, his own mercenaries in Somalia, because 6 months before this boat arrived, he had actually started building a compound on the outskirts of a city called Galkayo. Officially, this was a tuna fishing and farming venture run by a shell company he set up called Southern Ace, but unofficially, he was building a 300-man base for a militia that his contractors were working to recruit local Somalian clans to make up. He had a dirt runway here, greenhouses that would grow different types of dope. He even had AT-4 anti-tank rockets. And if this worked out, he planned to basically carve out a beachfront mini-state that answered to no flag but his own. He was going to need guns to do that. But the rest of these guns were pure inventory. Cartels, other militias, rebels, like whoever was offering the most cash and would pay the fastest. And oftentimes with the cartels, they wanted to settle up in product, so they were giving Paul meth and precursor drugs in exchange for his guns. And so in addition to guns, it's at this point that Paul starts getting into trafficking these hard drugs, but this is still in its infancy. It's going to grow over the next couple of years. Anyways, back to this first test run. They actually ran into some big problems off the shore of Manila. The first launch boat run was made in the middle of the night. They brought back 16 crates to one of the warehouses, but by first daylight, local fishermen had noticed this big boat idling out in the ocean, and they made a report to customs. And the custom officers didn't hesitate. They went to check it out, and by the time they got on board, they found 4 crates remaining, containing 54 Indonesian FNC pattern rifles, 45 bayonets, and 120 empty mags. Not bad considering they had gotten away with 16 crates already, but for Paul, this was one of his operation's first real blunders, and the investigations into this threatened to expose his whole empire. See, during the interrogations, custom officers learned that the South African captain took over the ship from Bruce Jones. They also learned about the crates that made it off in the night. Now, Bruce Jones was ultimately accused of bringing the guns into the Philippines. So he hightailed it, allegedly to the mountains near Manila, where he remained in hiding, more scared of what Paul Le Roux would do to him if caught than ending up in a prison. This gun seizure closure was big news, they took the entire boat. Eventually, a local journalist named Matti Supnod managed to contact Bruce, and Bruce agreed to meet Supnod for an interview at a secret location in an attempt to clear his name. Bruce claimed that he only realized too late that he had been working for criminals.
I believe him. I believe his story. According to him, he was just hired by the syndicate to load the guns from Indonesia. During the loading of the guns, it is being guarded by uniformed policemen in Indonesia. So he thought that it was really a legal transaction.
Bruce went on to say that he was being made the fall guy, in a scheme actually being controlled by a powerful foreign criminal based in Manila in cooperation with corrupt government officials.
He described the head of the syndicate to me, telling me that he was so influential and able to bribe the authorities, bribe the judiciary, and even the media, that he was being escorted by policemen.
Bruce was threatening to name those names. After this interview, Bruce suspected that he was unsafe, returned to hiding. After a year, he was eventually lured out by someone he thought was a friend. He didn't know that that friend was actually working for Le Roux. As he went to meet up, he sat down behind the wheel, started the car, waited for his wife and child to get seated. On the way, two masked men on motorbikes approached the vehicle from each side. They pulled out guns. In the blink of an eye, an entire magazine was dumped through his car window, and he was dead on the spot. A classic contract killing. And he wasn't the only one. In the years following this incident, the lawyer who represented Bruce vanished. To this day, he hasn't been found. The manager of Red and Blue Arms, who was overlooking this project for Paul, was murdered in the same way as Bruce while waiting at a traffic light. See, Paul had got the idea in his head at this point that the only way to maintain his growing empire was to kill anyone who was an operational risk. The only one that managed to escape from this was the journalist Supnad. That's because police managed to arrest his assassin before the assassination took place. And for Paul, he had now gotten away with murder, and the loss of one shipment didn't dissuade him. He was now going to set his sights on even bigger targets, starting with Iran. The loss of one shipment didn't dissuade Paul. If anything, it made him bolder. So far, most of his guns have been feeding local rebels, but now an actual country had noticed him: Iran. They came with a wish list: rifles, explosives, even missile guidance systems. For 3 years, Paul was a key arms supplier to the Iranian military. He had quickly become the guy who could get them things that no one else could. And Iran, at the time, they wanted a cheaper way to bleed American troops in Iraq. Paul had an idea to capitalize on this.
He sold a formula for explosives to the Iranian government for $5 million. And that deal did go through. So he had created this explosives formula, he sold it to them, and that was also a kind of down payment on a future work that he was doing, designing basically missile guidance systems for missiles in Iran. And he had a team of engineers in the Philippines, most of them were Romanian, who were working on that for him.
Bombs to be made from fertilizer, and Paul also had a network to supply this fertilizer. While all of this is going on, Paul was also making strides with his own compound in Somalia. He had sent a new head man down there to run it, a guy codenamed Jack. Another ex-military guy. Jack built the crew, dealt with pirates and local terrorist groups to carve out this section of the beach. But as Jack's group grew, it started to draw attention not only from local militias, but from the United Nations. See, during a UN field investigation into regional armed groups, analysts spotted an unfamiliar militia, well-equipped, professionally trained, and led by a foreigner. When they dug deeper, one name kept surfacing: Paul Le Roux. In July 2011, the UN Monitoring Group on Somalia published a 300-page report, which included a 5-page appendix titled Case Study Southern Ace. And of course, Paul Le Roux was the main subject. That was his shell company. This report publicly linked him to arms trafficking and a private militia in Somalia, including plans to import anti-tank missiles, C4, and over 1 million rounds of ammunition. Veteran DEA agent Kent Bailey got tipped off about the UN report, and he finally had his context on why Le Roux had been making so many calls to Somalia. By the end of 2011, with the UN report public, Paul grew excessively paranoid. Law enforcement would surely be coming, and someone had given the UN information, so Paul was looking at everyone in his inner circles, questioning their behavior. Dave Smith didn't help matters. Dave was the opposite of Paul, flashy, big cars, fast bikes, always surrounded by women. This made Paul furious. He interpreted this behavior as, well, either David was stealing from him, he was becoming more independent, which Paul didn't like, and it was just an operational security nightmare. So one night, on nothing but this suspicion, Paul called Dave in for a job, told him there was gold buried at a remote site. Dave showed up, brought a shovel. Little did he know that he would be digging his own grave. As soon as the hole was big enough to fit a body, Paul had his other men finish off Dave as he watched from the sidelines. With Dave gone, Paul now needed someone to keep running his empire, and that man would be Joseph Hunter, a former US Army sniper and drill sergeant with no conscience. He picked up where Dave left off. Pretty soon after that, Paul got suspicious of Jack. I mean, he was the one that was running the whole Somalian compound. Naturally, he could have been the one that told the UN. So Paul ordered a hit, but Jack was tipped off about the assassination and managed to disappear before they could get him. But while on the run, Jack did one thing. He left a voicemail to the CIA hotline. He named Paul, spilled all the information he had, and that message would give the US law enforcement a crazy idea. That was going to take a little time. Meanwhile, Paul's first baby, RX Limited, was in some trouble. See, all this time, it had still been providing him enormous profits, which he was using to fund this whole empire. But now, one of its biggest moneymakers, the painkiller Soma, was reclassified as a controlled substance in the US. And the one thing Paul was always careful about was to not sell illegal drugs or weapons into the US, because he knew they were one of the few countries capable of global law enforcement, and he didn't need any more reasons for Uncle Sam to come and find him. Plus, the doctors that were working for RX Limited couldn't prescribe it. So overnight, profits tanked. Got so bad, Paul had to shut down his call centers in Israel. But Paul wasn't about to take a hit to his net profit at the end of the year, and the only way he knew how to make up for it was more weapons, more illicit drug deals, more control, more hits. And one of those hits was personal. Her name was Catherine Lee, an established real estate officer in Manila. She had helped Paul acquire a lot of properties, knew a little bit too much about his real estate dealings. Seemingly out of the blue, she was contacted by two Canadians who wanted to buy properties in Manila. On February 12, 2012, her and her colleagues drove them around to several different properties. At the end of the visits, the two Canadians offered to give Catherine a ride home. Her friends and co-workers suggested that she didn't go with them, but she didn't listen. She was in for a big commission on any of these sales, after all. But that commission would never come, because these two weren't there to buy properties. The next day, garbage men found her rolled up in a rug. She had been shot beneath both eyes. The two men, actually from the USA, pretending to be Canadians, had been hired by Joseph Hunter, and they did a sloppy job. Catherine's colleagues saw them during the lengthy tour around the estates. Police were able to get their sketches quickly. Hunter had paid the hitmen $35,000 each, and now had sent them out of the country. And the reason for all this? Paul had suspected that Catherine, on a hunch, had been stealing from him and leaking information about his real estate dealings. Nomi Edilor, another real estate agent, met the same fate a few months before Catherine. This is really evil, and it was making Paul's other associates equally paranoid of him. They didn't know if they would be next. The other thing is, as these cases escalated, Manila was no longer safe for Paul. Catherine Lee's murder had finally brought heat that Paul couldn't pay off. See, after the hitmen were identified as foreigners, Philippine authorities kicked the case up to the National Bureau of Investigation, their version of the FBI. And unlike local cops, Paul couldn't bribe these guys. They worked with US authorities to track the men down. Eventually, they arrested David Stilwell and Adam Samia. And with this news, Paul went dark. When he finally came back online, he was 10,000 miles away, living in Brazil under a fake name. He had flown in with a pregnant girlfriend, Cindy Kayanan, who had been working for his organization in Manila. This was super important to Paul. He knew Brazil had strict extradition laws protecting him from the US, especially for parents who have children born in Brazil. By the time they got settled on a beachfront condo under a new front company called Rainbow Force Technologies, a supposed cybersecurity firm, she had popped, and Paul was protected. He once again felt insulated from US law enforcement. But little did he know, the DEA, through collaboration with the Brazilian authorities, had actually been watching him since the moment he landed. See, through some loopholes, they were piggybacking on a separate Brazilian investigation involving one of Paul's known associates, his top man from Hong Kong, Doran Schulman. See, they already had a legal wiretap on Doran because they were investigating him for health insurance fraud. And the DEA realized by proving that the two of them were in contact, they could legally open a wiretap on Paul using Brazil's existing legal framework. And what they found was way worse than any of them expected. Combing through his messages, Paul was arranging a shipment of bulk cargo routed through Brazilian ports. 24 metric tons declared as sodium chloride, table salt. Because, Paul's not shipping table salt. And the destination was to be one of his warehouses in Hong Kong. So the DEA tipped off customs in Brazil to check, and when they cracked open the containers, it was ammonium nitrate, 24 metric tons of it. That's the same stuff that was used in the Oklahoma City bombing, ingredients that Iran could use to build bombs. 2,000 pounds of this stuff can level a city block, and he had 52,000 pounds of it. Now, ammonium nitrate isn't illegal on its own. Farmers use it for fertilizer, but under all of this context, Paul was clearly up to no good. You would think that this would be enough for the DEA to stage an arrest in Brazil, but it wasn't. They didn't believe that they had enough to prosecute, not the way they wanted, because they knew Paul was beyond careful. His entire operation was being run on encrypted laptops after all, secure email servers that he made himself, networks that he built from the ground up. Even if they arrested him, even if they got access to his machines, the likelihood that they would be able to take any evidence off those and use it against him to prove his involvement, well, they weren't confident. And so if they were going to bust Paul, they had to do it in a location that they would be 100% certain that they could get extradition, so they could pressure him into opening up those devices on their own. And Brazil was not that spot. And so to do this, they were going to have someone from Paul's past life walk back into it with a deal that he couldn't refuse. And that man was going to be Jack. When Jack disappeared, Paul assumed that he had either died or left his life of crime. The truth was, after his tip-off phone call, US federal agents had got an idea. They didn't want to wait around for Paul to make another mistake. They wanted to engineer one. So they called Jack back, and he picked up. Found out his real name is Felix Clausen, but the agents still wanted him to be Jack, because they wanted him to get back in contact with Paul, present him with an offer. And so that's what Jack did. He told Paul that in the time he had been away, he had met a group of Colombian cocaine traffickers, and they were looking to expand. They were rich, aggressive, but more importantly, they had a problem that Paul could solve. They wanted to get into meth, especially in Asia and West Africa, because they saw it was exploding in popularity, but they didn't have a reliable lab setup or a supply chain for the precursor chemicals needed. But Paul, he could be just the man to deliver both. Upon hearing this offer, Paul apologized to Jack for putting a prize on his head and invited him back to work for him. After that, Jack got more involved in explaining the offer he had received. The Colombian traffickers wanted Paul to actually build the lab in Liberia, supply the precursor chemicals, and fly in a cook to train their own operators. From there, they would take over, handle distribution, selling the meth. They wanted to even export it into Mexico and the United States. The deal was for every 100 kilograms of meth they produced, the Colombians would send Paul 100 kilograms of cocaine. Paul couldn't resist. He was in. There was just one catch. The Colombians wouldn't talk over email, no encrypted chats, no burner phones. They demanded a face-to-face meeting in Liberia. Paul was naturally hesitant. He was living in Brazil now under a false identity. He knew he was shielded by the country's strict extradition laws, but Liberia, this was dangerous territory. The US had close diplomatic ties. He knew he could be extradited and fast. But still, the payout was too big to ignore. So in September 2012, Paul, alongside his girlfriend, boarded a flight to Monrovia. What Paul didn't know was that every step of that journey had been planned. Colombians didn't exist. There was to be no meth lab. The whole operation was a DEA honeypot codenamed Operation Prophecy. When Paul landed, Jack met him at the Royal Grand Hotel alongside a supposed Colombian trafficker. This is another DEA agent in disguise. They embraced like old friends, but Jack knew he had to be beyond careful. The DEA had suited him with a hidden camera and a wire. He, alongside the fake trafficker, were to tease out the details from Paul on camera. Jack knew, if caught, they both would be dead. Later that day, they sat down to talk shop. Paul spoke freely about the meth plan, described where the precursors would come from, how production would work, and even offered to fly in a chemist. and the whole thing was caught on tape. This recording changed everything. It gave US prosecutors what they had always been missing, proof that Paul was directing international drug trafficking, a violation of US Code 959, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances outside of the United States. And this was their ticket. The next morning, a team of DEA agents and Liberian National Police surrounded the hotel. Inside, Paul was asleep. His girlfriend answered the knock. The agents burst through the door. They had one target in mind: his laptop. Because Paul had built his own private email servers, used encrypted chat clients, had fully encrypted his disk, they feared that he had also built kill switches that at the click of a button he could wipe everything. But he never got the chance, because they got to the laptop first. And that's when Paul realized what was happening. He started passively defending himself, tried to bribe and manipulate the Liberian officers, calling them African brothers and trying to play "I was born on the same continent as you guys" card, but they had none of it. When paying them off failed, Paul used his massive weight. He laid on the ground and said he wasn't going anywhere. The agents weren't able to pull out his arms to cuff him. Tasing him didn't work either. After a struggle, 10 DEA officers managed to cuff the big man and drag him down 3 flights of stairs. Straining every muscle, they stuffed him into a van and started the journey to the airport. Just outside the plane, bound for the US, he tried the same trick, but it didn't work. Once on board, Paul's behavior finally changed to compliance. He wasn't trying to bribe anyone, he wasn't screaming or even cursing. The only words that came out of his mouth were, "Well played, gentlemen, well played." Then, "Just promise me I won't die in jail. That's all I want." Little did he know the DEA wasn't planning to put him in jail. Not yet. They were planning to put him back in business. Kemp Bailey and Kimberly Brill stood on the tarmac in White Plains, New York, waiting for the plane carrying the man they had been chasing for 5 years. It was a bittersweet moment because they didn't get to participate in the arrest. That honor had gone to a different group, a specialized unit inside the DEA called Group 960, referring to the statute that they worked under to catch bad guys selling narcotics internationally. At 3 a.m., Kent and Kimberly had finally got a glimpse of Paul in person for the very first time. Then they returned to their hotel because they were to join in on the initial questioning to happen later that morning. But just before that meeting took place, they got bad news. The hearing was off. Hours earlier, Paul had been introduced to a court-appointed lawyer, Jonathan Marvini, and just like that, Paul signed a cooperation agreement. Even stranger, there would be no press conference announcing the capture of one of the most prolific criminals the DEA had ever faced, because they knew he was the only kingpin that operated completely online. They had snatched him out of view of any of his employees or associates, and now they could put him to work from DEA custody as if he was still at large. Paul had agreed not to just help catch his associates, but to share information about dealings he had with Iran and North Korea. Kemp Bailey wasn't so convinced. He warned that Paul was smart enough to manipulate them if the agents weren't careful, but within the 960 group, Kent's objections were viewed as the grumblings of an agent who hadn't been able to land the case. That's because while Kent and Kimberly agreed to let the 960 agents make the arrest through some legal technicalities, the 960 agents were also entitled to the case, and they essentially stole it from Kent and Kimberly despite their years of hard work. But nevertheless, they cast off this warning from Kent. And the 960 agents put Paul to work, hoping that whatever he delivered would be greater than what they already had. A cartel architect, an arms trafficker, a murderer, a man responsible for flooding the US with hundreds of millions of pills. If he delivered, he'd be the biggest cooperating witness in DEA history. But if he didn't, they would have been played again. Paul flipped unbelievably quick. When later asked why, he just said he was in a bad spot. He signed a proffer agreement. Under the terms, Paul was free to talk to prosecutors without fear. Nothing he told them could be used against him. Any lies or omissions, however, could. At first, he was hesitant about the killings, but eventually he came clean. Admitted to selling hundreds of millions of pills to Americans, smuggling weapons from Indonesia, exporting arms to Iran, producing meth with North Koreans, moving massive quantities of meth and cocaine, and organizing 7 murders. But the names were not enough for the 960 group. They wanted to arrest the rest of the big hitters from Paul's group. They set him up inside a secure room with a mattress and a laptop. Paul felt at home. And his encryption was so tight that it was only now with him cooperating that they were able to get into his email and servers. They found that he had configured his email server previously to delete all emails on a periodical basis. But now he coded a change for them to keep a copy of all the new emails that would be sent and come in so the DEA could later use those as evidence. Then Paul slipped back into running his empire. The DEA had a plan for him. They were going to continue the Colombian drug deal scheme. Say it went through because the DEA had set their first sights on a specific target, Joseph Hunter, the former US Army sniper that had taken the job of Paul's right-hand man after the killing of Dave. Paul told Hunter and the group of mercenaries working under him that the deal went through and now the Colombians needed protection. Through Paul, the DEA lured them to the island of Phuket on the coast of Thailand. They had set up a wiretap on a villa there, and on recording, they got Hunter admitting to everything: drug trafficking, arms handling, and even murders. With this evidence, they were confident in a full-blown conviction. The last part was to actually catch him. But because he was who he was and he had all these mercenaries working under him, they weren't just going to leave it to local police. Instead, they called in Thailand's elite tactical force, and on September 24th, 2013, more than a year after Paul had been caught, they raided the villa where Hunter was staying. He didn't stand a chance. And later, the other members of Hunter's squad met a similar fate. Paul, only listed on records as Individual 1, testified against Hunter. Hunter was initially sentenced to 20 years, but then, after the trial for Catherine Lee's murder, he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Meanwhile, the DEA wanted the men that were left in charge of RX Limited. Since the change in laws around Soma, RX Limited had been run into the ground. Credit card processors had stopped letting them take payments, FedEx and other shippers closed the pharmacy accounts so nothing could be sent, and warning letters and subpoenas made their way to doctors, which spooked many of them into leaving the platform. Before his arrest, Paul had sent a series of encrypted emails to the two Israelis that had been leading the company, Moran Oz and Alam Berkman. See, the Tiger brothers had long been cut out of RX Limited after they demanded bigger cuts when the company exploded mid-2006. In these encrypted emails, Paul told Oz and Berkman three things. 1. Close the Tel Aviv and Jerusalem call centers immediately. 2. Lay everyone off and issue severance required under Israeli labor law. And 3. Move the servers tied to the RX Limited customer database and affiliate panels to Manila for safekeeping. And they had done just that. Paul had sent a wire in the low six figures to cover the owed wages and severance, but it wasn't quite enough. He promised to send a second transfer, but it never came. Yet Oz was being hounded for severance by the workers, who many of whom thought he was the actual owner of the business. They were mad that he had shut it down and now wasn't paying them. Desperate for answers, Oz sent frantic emails to Paul, but each one went unanswered. Then, one night in late December 2013, Paul resurfaced. He said, "I know you're hurting. There's light at the end of the tunnel. I have arranged your cash." Oz felt immediate relief. Paul even mentioned plans to resurrect RX Limited, a way to rebuild it from the ground up. Oz was going to help with that too, but his first order of business was getting people paid. There was just one strange catch. Paul told Oz he had to collect the money in person. Paul initially suggested Panama, but Oz refused, wary of the location. Eventually, they agreed on Romania instead. But in the middle of these talks, Oz came across a troubling headline from a Brazilian newspaper claiming Paul had been arrested, linked to arms smuggling and drug trafficking and multiple murders. This posed a problem not just for Oz, but also for the DEA, who desperately hoped no American media would pick up on the story. Oz questioned Paul about it. Paul, giving Oz a very rare phone call, managed to convince him otherwise. Told him that the paper was exaggerating, that he was still at large under a fake identity, that there was nothing to be worried about. And so Oz made the flight to Romania, a true testament at just how convincing Paul could be. Oz arrived with 2 hired bodyguards, paranoid that Paul might be planning to kill him. Paul, of course, never showed. Instead, plainclothes cops closed in. Oz spent months in a 7-foot-wide Romanian cell before a judge signed his extradition to the United States for his involvement in RX Limited. Meanwhile, Berkman saw the headlines and vanished. To this day, he hasn't been found. At trial, prosecutors argue Oz knew exactly what RX Limited was doing, personally directing or at the very least fully aware of the illegal drug shipments into the US arrest, but after 3 years in custody in an unexpected turn, Oz was acquitted, released, and sent back to Israel. Still, this operation brought him big results. Following his arrest, a cascade of related busts hit doctors, pharmacists, and former call center higher-ups. A massive 35-count indictment was unsealed that November. They had taken down what was left of RX Limited's network in the United States. Meanwhile, Paul was continuing to cooperate extensively. He sat with FinCEN analysts to unravel his complex web of shell company ledgers to trace where all his money had ended up. From this, Hong Kong regulators froze multiple accounts containing over $50 million, with the Department of Justice filing civil forfeiture claims shortly after. Then Paul guided DE agents to his secret vaults. They recovered around $6 million in gold bars and cash, later forfeited through plea deals. Finally, he meticulously diagrammed the missile guidance systems he had been contracted to design for Iran, and even shared with the CIA detailed profiles of North Korean chemists involved in plans for a meth superlab. These disclosures directly influenced Treasury sanctions issued in 2014 and 2015. But now, Paul had given all he could. His usefulness was over, and the DEA had a difficult decision ahead. What were they going to do with Paul Le Roux? 8 years after his arrest, Paul finally stepped back into a federal courtroom. Except there was no big perp walk or news headlines. His docket was still sealed. Paul had been too helpful, and perhaps now, too controversial to turn into a media spectacle. The cooperation deal he had signed in secret 7 years earlier would help him now. Anything he had told the agents while dismantling his own empire was off limits at sentencing. They had to rely on the evidence they collected on their own before his arrest. Thanks to this agreement, Paul was charged with only donating missiles to Iran, RX Limited, and meth trafficking. His charges did not include the 7 murders, but that was enough. In June 2020, Judge Ronnie Abrams laid it out. Your crimes are staggering, Mr. Le Roux, yet so is the assistance you provided. Then she made her decision, 25 years, with credit for time served. Paul could walk free as early as 2031, in his mid-50s. But upon his release, Paul is expected to be deported to the Philippines, where prosecutors are awaiting to charge him for the Captain Yufuk weapons smuggling scandal and the 7 murders he has confessed to.
He could potentially be charged with murder. He's admitted to 7 murders that took place in the Philippines, so he could be charged with murder. He's very afraid of the death penalty being reinstated in the Philippines, so I think that's his nightmare, is if he gets deported to the Philippines, he's charged with murder, the death penalty gets voted back in, and he gets the death penalty.
But for now, he sits in a medium security New York cell, waiting for that day, still hoping that he won't die in jail.